One of the premium features at FantasyOmatic.com is the research section. Now, the research section may appear to look a lot like the weekly rankings section. It's really a similar format, and we are sorting by default in descending order by the week rating. But there's a couple of different differences here. The first thing is that you're looking at all the players in the Fantasy-O-Matic database. So this includes not only players who are starting in the current week, but players who might be on IR or bench players. So there's a ton more players available to you in research. So if you don't find somebody on a weekly rankings, you can maybe check the research. Maybe they're not projected to be playing this week. The other thing is you look at the edit filters section along the top. It means that you can pick whichever positions you want to see. So for example, you can combine some together, create your own flex rankings for the week, for example. And here you can also filter it by the players who are projected to start. So in this case, I've created a running back and wide receiver flex combination for the current week. Now, if I want to remove any of these filters, I just click on the X next to it, and I can choose new ones at any time. So you'll notice that just like on the week rankings pages, the page here that you see is by default sorted in reverse order on week ranking with the highest week ranking at the top. But on the research section, you can actually sort by other columns like the player rating. Now, player rating is the cumulative value of the player as determined by the algorithm based on all the games that they've played so far this season. So this tells you what's the value of this player right now. This is something that can be evaluated for trade purposes on just a direct comparison between two different players. Now, the week rating, of course, is the rating that the algorithm projects for the current week. And the difference between those two is also something that's kind of an interesting metric. That's the MU adjustment or matchup adjustment value that you see in the middle. This simply says what's the difference between what the player's year-to-date rating is, or the player rating, and what they're expected to have as far as production is concerned this week. So when you see large numbers there with the green arrow, that tells you can expect a lot more from a player than they would on a current week. And the interesting thing here too is you can sort by the matchup adjustment column, and it gives you kind of an expect more, expect less type view. In this case, we're looking at the current week, and I can see all the players with the green arrows I can expect more from this week, and all the players with the red arrows I could expect less from. And to what degree I can change my expectations is determined by the number that you see next to the arrow. So a player with a plus 20, I expect to see a much larger performance than their normal week. But a player with a plus 1 is probably closer to the norm than anything. And the players with zeros just tell us they're pretty much expected to do the same thing this week as they would in any other. Now, you can actually go forward and look at future weeks. So for example, let's say I want to look at all the quarterbacks, see who's got the best week rating on the first week of the fantasy playoffs, or even on every week of the fantasy playoffs. Or I could even combine different position categories if I'd like to. So this way, if you're trying to make a trade to try to win in the playoffs, you can look for players for certain weeks that might have value. Or you can go to the forecast section. When you go into the forecast section, your filters are still applied. You see that the default order will be the player rating, but then you can choose a rest of season sort. Now, rest of season just looks at all the games that the player has yet to play, so it's the current week all the way to the end of the fantasy playoffs, and it comes up with a cumulative rating. So if that rating is lower than the player's current rating, that means that the player could potentially trend down, or potentially they've peaked, or maybe they've seen all their good matchups. Either way, it tells you can expect a little bit less. In this case, as you see, an 84 is a little bit less of an expectation from an 86, but pretty much the same moving forward. But if you find players with dramatic differences, like a 69 to a 72, somewhat dramatic, I guess, that tells you that maybe this player's best performances are yet to come this season. Those might be players that you want to acquire in a trade. So a simple rule of thumb is you really don't want to trade away any players that have a green arrow pointing up for the rest of the season, because maybe they'll still have more value, and you don't want to trade for any players that have a red down arrow. Now, in a similar fashion, you can look at what a player's fantasy playoffs look like. This is the last 3 games of the fantasy season. So if you just want to isolate those 3 games and look at a cumulative rating for each of those, you can sort by those. Now, granted, the arrows might tell a little bit different story here. So, for example, a player that has a 83 playoff rating has a down red arrow. All that says is that's down based on where they're currently at on their player rating for the year. That 83 is still better than a 72. You can expect a lot better performances out of a player with an 83 for the playoffs than you can for a 61 or a 59, for example, even though this 59 has a green up. So all these arrows do is tell us what we can expect for the player moving forward based on their current player rating. The rest of it is just sorting like a number. So you can see that these players are expected to have the best fantasy playoff performances as quarterbacks. I can go into my filters and I can choose running backs if I want to. And I can sort in descending or ascending order there and see which players are expected to have the best performances in the last 3 weeks of the season. So by doing various combinations like this, you can find players that you either want to acquire or maybe see how your players are expected to do for the rest of the season. And you can even click on the player and find out the detailed information about them right from the research page. So you can use this one to learn a little bit more about players on your team, players that you want to trade for or trade away. And then you can even do trade evaluations just like you can in the other sections as well based on some of the findings that you have here. So hopefully you enjoy the research section. This is really one of the areas where you can spend a lot of time in the Fantasy-O-Matic application, and there's all sorts of interesting values for a player that you don't get anywhere else on the site.